We heard some quite interesting things in the movie about the democratization of data, governments publishing data that perhaps wasn't accessible before. We heard about the Justice Mapping Center, which was showing patterns of prison and repeat prison imprisonment. We heard about people saying we can now make politicians listen to the stories behind the data. We heard about citizens actually authoring better data sets than the government can possibly build. So I'm wondering, can you help us think about your reflections on the film? What struck you? And is this essentially good news for the oppressed?
No. Hate to say that, but definitely not.
And welcome, Glenn.
What actually surprised me was, in a sense, how boringly familiar most of what they were talking about was. Yes, we are going to be more connected. Yes, there's a whole lot of potential additional data. Yes, it's very exciting that with Twitter and various other things that we can map things like disasters. But there was very little there that was actually significantly different to what we're doing now, except that it was more so. I mean, one of the things that reminded me is they were saying, you know, look, we mapped this whole area of Brooklyn, or wherever it was it Chicago, wherever it was, where they found all of these crime things. I can remember, and some of the people in the audience might, when Tony Vincent did something like that, who was one of our professors in another university at one stage, way back, I think it was in the 1980s originally, or 70s, or things, where he mapped certain postcodes as being full of people who had disadvantage. And there was a big fuss and a big hoo-ha, and the government sent out various people, and all sorts of things happened there. The areas actually became very problematic because by defining the postcode, you actually labelled everybody in there as a loser. So people who lived in those areas had a serious problem after that, like Mount Druitt, I think, has still got the problems of that. And 20 odd years later, he went back and did it again. And guess what? He found that actually his previous exercise hadn't changed anything and hadn't altered anything. And that really sets me up with the problem that I think we need to address. And it's one that comes very much out of my experience as an advocate and as somebody who's taught research methods, is data in itself doesn't change anything.
Can we bring all the lines up?
Access to data, who controls the data, and what you do with the data is the essential point. And that was far too much the optimistic, oh, look at all of these exciting things we've done. We're already in data overload. Before I came here today, I downloaded something like 5 new research reports I should read. We've got masses of data. We don't use it very effectively already. We are not very good at making use of what we have. Getting this more sophisticated data will make more of us vulnerable to the people that may not be particularly concerned about our well-being, being able to get data that they want to use. But I cannot see out of that there's an enormous change. I mean, what you're looking about is the oppressed. Okay. One of the lessons I learned very early in the piece was people who've got power don't need data. In fact, they'd rather not have it in many cases, because a good set of data ruins a perfectly acceptable set of political decisions if you've got some data that actually contradicts what you want to do. Politicians, and unfortunately very often big business and things like that, they're looking for the data that backs up what they want to do. Sometimes they'll be innovative and look for something new and different. But generally they're trying to fulfill their particular brief, whether it's making a profit or whether it's creating a particular situation. So therefore, if you're actually like me, one of the advocates who tends not to be on the side of power and influence, you actually are using your data to embarrass or try and catch out the political system by pointing out you're saying X but Y is actually occurring. And I've recently done that by pulling together something that's coming out in a journal of Indigenous policy out of Jumbunna in the next few weeks, looking at the evidence of what works in Aboriginal communities. We have a massive amount of evidence of what works in Aboriginal communities. We have a government that gets the advice from the Institute of Health and Welfare, which everybody knows is a terribly respectable group, and the Productivity Commission, which I jokingly said to a Senate inquiry one day, those well-known left-wing think tanks, because they're both to the right of Genghis Khan, to put it mildly. They're very respectable, hardline, central things. They say, this is what works in Indigenous communities, this is the evidence, this is what do you think the government's paying any attention to it? No, they don't. It's the same with a lot of the welfare stuff and a lot of the other stuff I do, which is social stuff. Governments are not interested in getting data that contradicts their political intentions. You can see it very clearly with the current government and lots of its social policy stuff. So data becomes, if you can use it properly, a way that you can confront the system sometimes and work it or get round the system, and that's probably one of the few interesting things that comes out there, how far you can get round it.
Okay.
What really worries me is the fact that without some sense of the things there, that what we will do is find that the data gets used against us, because the other point I want to make, and I'll finish off with that thing, is when you're coding data, you lose a lot of its power. You lose a lot of what you can do. I'm a researcher. And in order to code things, you have to simplify them. You have to be able to make them codable. That means you've got to simplify the things that count, which is relationships, feelings, connections, society, all of those things that might end up on, if you like, the more feminised version. And I did notice that that was full of mainly white males telling us what to do. But, you know, in a sense, there's an awful lot that cannot be represented appropriately in data just by the very fact that it is coded and it is categorisable. You lose a lot of the things that make life important. And what does worry me is in the process of that if you have a lot of algorithms that are imposed on things, we're going to actually control a lot of the things that make society good places to live in order to keep things under control. Data can be used to control us if the people in power use it. That shows up. But data as a form of social change, we haven't done very well on it so far. Some things we've done. I can give you examples of those. But generally, having data in itself, not under the control of the people who are most capable of actually using it politically to change things, is really quite dangerous.
Okay, so some scepticism there about whether politicians want data, although
politicians, big business, people of power.
Well, we do know that corporations want big data for their purposes, of course.
Exactly.
You're sceptical that more data is actually going to be helpful. But at the same time, you've talked about using good data for what you would consider to be good purposes to confront the powers that be. So
the problem is it doesn't work very often.
It doesn't work, okay.
I can probably give you 2 or 3 examples over my 40 years of advocacy where we've actually managed to change something, and that's usually because we're not running against the ideological commitments of the people who make the decisions.
Okay, well...
So, I mean, it's part of the debate,
yep.
But it's not conclusive.
All right. Well, I'd like to throw it open to the other panellists here. Have you got other perspectives? Do you agree with Eva? She has a fairly dark view about whether all this compute power is really going to make much difference when it comes to creating a more equitable society. Other perspectives?
I mean, I think there's some counterexamples. I remember during a tsunami in Japan.
Could you hit your mic, by the way? Yeah.
I remember.
It's not on.
There you go. There we go. I mean, I think there were some good counterexamples where one I just came immediately to mind was during the tsunami in Japan. I think it was one of the car companies realised they had GPSs, built into cars, and they were able to take the data back from that and then use that to analyse and overlay it over the road system and determine which roads were available for rescue and humanitarian.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't talking about that. I mean, that sort of data, yes, does come in.
And I think, in some sense, there are going to be. I'll be a bit more optimistic. Maybe I'm too optimistic, maybe. But I think there are some good examples where we could use data and make it available. And I've been encouraged, I guess, by data and open data being available for people to use in an entrepreneurial way to develop new ideas, new opportunities, solve problems and so on. So I'd like to think that it wasn't quite as dark a world out there than perhaps you'd characterised. Now I do worry, and I came from a company that was in a computing industry where data was big data was a business opportunity, but I don't necessarily think everybody's in it for evil, dark purposes.
Self-interest rather than evil, yes.
Whoever controls the flow of information in a society, whoever controls the flow of information in a society controls that society. That movie was a very slick and very powerful piece of propaganda. One of the most interesting parts of it were the sponsors at the beginning, who all had an economic stake, or perhaps all of them, in big data exploiting big data for their commercial interests.
Yeah.
The movie showed
Can
one...
I interrupt? There was an example in there. I happen to know the researcher from Canada, and this is a project that IBM Research, which I was part of previously, did.
Yeah.
And she was the one with the neonatal. And it was about streaming data out of all of the equipment in a neonatal ward to improve the ability to respond to or anticipate, changes in the health of that.
Well, this is the point I'd like to make.
So I don't think that's a bad thing.
No, that's the point I'm trying to make. The film showed very skillfully a whole lot of knowledgeable and well-meaning and well-intentioned people using big data for beneficial purposes, for our health and well-being, for our security, in the interests of justice and data management. Then it raised a couple of problems. Target, who turned out to be right in the end, and it took a swipe at the NSA, and it took a swipe at Wall Street, and then went back to all the beneficial and wonderful good uses to which big data can be put. And we ought to find ways to facilitate the collection, the aggregation, the analysis of big data for those kinds of purposes. But the overwhelming use of big data is by large corporations who are mining our data, commodifying our personal and sensitive information to the value of hundreds of billions of dollars, the largest corporations in the world. And governments are then outsourcing their law enforcement and national security activities to these data collection efforts. So the overwhelming part of the story is the commodification of data, of which we have as yet not a very good understanding, not good control, and of which we are not the primary benefits, unless we think that serving ads to us and getting free apps by giving up our privacy, our human dignity, and the control over our lives, free from manipulation by large corporations. If we think that that's a good bargain, then we're blindly walking into a new kind of society. So I think we have to, technology is not policy. I think we have to find ways of facilitating these beneficial uses, and they're wonderful, and we should promote that kind of use of information. And there's not enough of that, and at the same time protect our autonomy, our independence, and our democracy by managing the way that our data is collected, analysed, and exploited.
I think what I want to add to that also, and I totally agree with what has been said, and in response to what Glenn just said about the data that's been collected about the babies in the neonatal unit, is that a lot of times that is really admirable work, and certainly very useful example of how a scrutiny of data can actually help reveal certain things. But a lot of times, what happens when such big sets of data are used on our bodies, or to interrogate or to understand and to reveal things about our bodies, is that they get collapsed into just trends. And for maybe a doctor, it may be very useful, who has a very good holistic understanding of how things affect each other. But for me, and for a lot of users like myself, and I'm experimenting with this, I've got the Fitbit track, I've got the Basis track. It tracks my heartbeat. It gives me a really, really good picture of supposedly picture of my heartbeat, my sleep pattern, my skin conductance, all my bodily movements. But it tells me, well, most of it, especially sleep, actually, and it tells me in the morning when I sync my watch, it says, you've had 76% quality sleep. And it doesn't make sense. What is that? What does 76% quality means, and what can I do about it?
24% short of ideal.
So I think a lot of it for me is actually when I talk to people using such data set, it's actually sense making. And it's quite dangerous because I found, and a lot of research are finding that a lot of the sensors that are being deployed that are so lauded in this movie are not accurate. And people are making decisions.
What's not accurate?
The sensors.
The sensors.
Yeah, and because they're not exactly, I mean, they can be a bit loose, and sometimes you don't wear them all the time. And the worst thing is that I don't own the data. I can't download the data. I can look at it online, but the companies own the data because they say that, well, by having your data, then we can compare with thousands or millions of others who are also uploading the data so that we can give you a better picture of who you are. So there is a trade-off, and so I have to create I have to create another name for myself using a different email to log myself so that, it makes it a little bit more difficult for them to track that it is me. And they want to know everything from the age, but a lot of the things that they're telling me also are normalized data based on a certain model of health, of certain male, okay? So with the genetic stuff, you can actually test your gene now. But when I investigated that further as a researcher, I found that Asian people shouldn't do that because the bank of knowledge they have about the genome does not apply very well to Asian gene. Okay, so we have quite.
So we just need more data.
So what I'm trying to say really in a short, brief way is that, first of all, we can't necessarily trust the data that we're collecting and we're sending out and that we're using. And secondly, I'm afraid that a lot of times the data get flattened out, just like what Eva is saying. And then we're making kind of just reductive decisions about people. I've kind of been involved in the research like that. So Nathan Eagle, one of the people in the film from MIT, used to be from MIT, now worked with this colleague where we tracked 3 million phone calls in Japan over a year, and by using the telco who released the numbers to us anonymously, so we know them by ID, we don't know who they are, but we know where they live and where they sleep, because where the phone were not moving very much at night and the phone were during the day, we could kind of work out, well, that's probably where they lived and where they slept and where they worked. And we could also then overlay the GPS movement of each of the ID against public transport in Japan. And then we could work out where they were hanging out in certain times, and then overlay the weather pattern because we had access to weather, barometer, wind, rain, sunshine, daylight, everything. So we could actually work out, make inferences that when it's warm, over 25 degrees at night, people tend to hang out longer, and they hang out in that particular area. So we could actually find patterns and stuff like that.
So you've given examples where data can both flatten out and abstract and lose and strip away important detail. And now you've also given us an example where it can allow you to actually infer all sorts of connections from overlaying multiple data sets.
However, we don't know anything about what people were doing there. I mean, we just know that they were there,
right?
But we had very little understanding at all about. But if someone were to take over this data and say, "Oh wow, let's make decisions about public transport then. Let's make decisions about opening hours. Let's make decisions about staffing." I mean, that's not enough in terms of that set of data, but it looks convincing.
All right.
So.
Yes, Glenn?
From my perspective, I completely understand and Emma's concerned about the exploitation, the misuse of data and the ability of organisations to do bad things with them. I also, I said before, I'm somewhat optimistic that there are some really good applications here. But I guess, being pragmatic, the reality is that companies do exist and they have built business models around it, and most people have no clue when they search on Google that they're actually trading information and that information can be aggregated and that bad things might happen. So in my mind, the kind of key question is, the big data world, whether we like it or not, whether that's a good term, I don't really like the term, to be honest, it is upon us. So how do we live in it, and what do we need to do differently in order to try and create a better world where good things can happen and less bad things can happen?
I agree with you.
Yeah. But I think one of the things to do is also to stop venerating data as though it is, because it's not. It's a representation of what's happening. And it's often a bad representation, sometimes an inadequate one. We already have some experience. I mean, we've been dealing with lots of data for a very long time. We're not very good at it. But this sort of stuff, I mean, I agree with you completely, you know, was PR crap about, oh, look at all the lovely things that we're doing. And in a sense, it sort of makes an assumption that, you know, that somehow or other we can control this and this is really informative. Yet, you know, what was just being said is you can get an awful lot of data that is rubbish and things of that sort, but you can also get data that can then be used, you know, to control people's behaviour. And that becomes...
And I'm as concerned as you are about the misuse of it and the misinterpretation of it.
Yeah, but very few people are prepared to say, question the data.
So I think the first thing we have to do is value the data and value our privacy, fundamentally. Privacy is a human right under Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's an element of human dignity. And when we give out our private information, we should only do so with truly informed, true consent for what purpose that data is used. We need to understand and value the data because when it's collected, it gets a new significance and a new value. And when it's aggregated, it gets a new value and a new significance. And when it's connected with other data and analysed, it gets another value. And we can be manipulated by the very rich and detailed and sensitive profile that can be used by corporations to anticipate our behaviour and manipulate our perceptions and manipulate our buying habits. So we get the answers in our searches that the search engines think we're looking for. And we are marketed to in ways that are very subtle, contextually and behaviourally targeted at us. These analysts know more about us than perhaps we know about ourselves and anticipate our behaviour. And there is an economy, a supply chain, a value chain, worth hundreds of billions of dollars in which the value is our personal data. So the challenge for us is to manage our data so that we get the value that we want from it. And I think one of the first things we need is to introduce a right to privacy in our law. We don't have the right to privacy in Australian law. Other countries do. And I think perhaps we should start subscribing to the notion that we should have a property right in our information and give consent to license only those uses in the market that we wish to license, and perhaps charge a fee for that use. Because we live in a market economy, perhaps by commodifying our private information, that may be the only way that we can control and manage it.
Which country, I mean, I noticed that Europe seems to be probably the most advanced area in terms of challenging this and trying to reveal this. And I'm, at recent experience where I was, unbelievably surprised about the lack of right to privacy just in normal neighbourly domestic things, for example. So I'd agree with you that a right to privacy and making those transactions more explicit is really, really important.
Just briefly on that, because you're talking about it very much within that sort of market economic sort of terms. But I think one of the more toxic possibilities is the fact that, they're beginning to do it, that people sort of start exploring your Facebook and your other things like that, and they knock you out of jobs. They create personal profiles of who you are via, what you say on Twitter, what you say on Facebook, and what your purchasing patterns are, and so on. And that we will end up with a sort of research thing which says this is the ideal worker, never mind consumer, for this particular industry. And unless you sort of match up in varying ways, you're going to be knocked out on that. I think the way that they can profile people by using some of that data can be used in much more toxic ways to sort of try and filter out people who are deviant from an appropriate profile for particular types of jobs, or for being a student at a university, or for being various other things, because it'll be very easy to say, oh look, the students we want should have these characteristics, and unless you turn up with this sort of purchasing things and this sort of personal things and this sort of healthcare, health prediction things, and we're going to check out your genetics to make sure you're not going to sort of fall off the twig at an appropriate moment, that we completely lose any sense of control over a whole lot of areas of our lives, not just our purchasing power. I think we focus very heavily on that, but I can see that this could be done in terms of becoming a student, of becoming a worker, you know, having a relationship with people, you know, there'll be this idea that somehow or other there is this sort of data existence of people that can be used. And I mean, even the stuff that we were talking about earlier about the healthcare thing, you know, well, anybody who can't control their eating habits is obviously not somebody we want in our organisation. If they eat too many chocolate biscuits and are overweight, we don't want them here, you know. And I mean, this sort of stuff can very easily creep into it if people have faith in the fact that data has an answer to complex questions.
Well, I'd like to bring John in here because I mean, we've talked about health data is probably about the most personal that it gets, right? And you are in the business of helping people understand their health and hopefully prevent the kinds of things that none of us hope will ever happen to us. So give us the perspective from your
Well, just to link it to the video that was in the neonatal ward there, the prem baby, the loss of data, that, you know, once an hour they're writing down 1 or 2 figures about a heart rate and everything. And, you know, if you're a diabetic, you might do 1,000 finger prick blood glucose tests a year. Your GP may see the 1 or 2 he or she does in their office. All the rest is lost. You know, we now have the technology, of course, a wireless glucometer. Every test you do should be fed straight into your patient record of your doctor's practice management software. And when the doctor sees you, that whole history of all those results will be there. We can do that now. In fact, we're doing it as we speak. You mentioned Tuck, your activity monitor. You know, that's my one that we used in Ararat to get the 36,000 kilos of loss. But, you know, monitoring activity is what we did there was quite unique. Was created a social network amongst a lot of small groups, work groups, friends, family, you know, peers in a neighbourhood and everything. And even though we set up one challenge for Biggest Loser for the people of Ararat, there's been 500 new challenges created by the people of Ararat who are still using the devices. But we also gave them access to a blood pressure device, a set of scales wirelessly linked in, and that data still flows every day. I can walk into my office every day and see what's happening in the entire town of Ararat. They continue to lose weight, get fit. That data is now pumped through to their GPs because the local area health service and the Medicare local groups all got on board. And so, you know, you're now seeing, you know, the richness of that data being presented to the people who are making the decisions about your health or helping you to support your health. And, you know, it's getting to the point now where there's some interesting data out that shows if you walk at over 6.8 kilometres an hour, the anti-diabetic effect of walking at that speed is 80% greater than walking at 4 kilometres an hour. So now we can load up the algorithm that looks at your activity. We call it a diabetes minute. But, you know, we can drop the likelihood of you developing diabetes by 80% by using this device to feed into a system where your doctor sees it and says, look, you're averaging 3.6 kilometres an hour for your 1,200 steps a day. You need to get X amount of this amount. And so the doctor can use good data to provide good information to manage that. Even now, I worked for 4.5 years for the company that developed the sensor that is at the core of all glucometers. You know, they sold it once to Roche for 1.2 billion and once to Abbott for 1.1 billion. But we've now miniaturised that to the point we can implant it and have the constant data feed. So it's not 3 times a day with a finger prick anymore. It's a constant flow of your actual blood glucose every minute of every day. It can go in and your doctor can see that trace. Okay. You know, it's just remarkable what all this information can do. And that the diabetes app that we've developed with the walking speed, you know, it's being trialled on 260,000 Deutsche Telekom employees at the moment, and this is all happening. And it's I can just, from the health side of things, I just think the data loss and the data that we don't get is inhibiting good decision making and good behavioural change support that we can provide to people.
So, I mean, what's not to like about something like that, we might ask?
Because you can get the sack for eating too many chocolate biscuits because you've been checking your blood thing and you're actually failing to do the right thing. I mean, I think I'd be interested in your comment on the privacy because, in a sense, that stuff there, and you're getting a bit of it already with that sort of moralising about whether or not one should have a drink in particular stages and various other things. You could very easily get a corporation or even a national thing where you started punishing people for their failure to take the appropriate steps.
Right. So there's a real issue about who gets hold of the data and what they might do with it. John?
Yeah. Look, there's two great examples of this. Detroit Truck and Diesel in the US actually set a date for smoking cessation, and they put on that day they put the cotinine sensors in, and you were sacked from your job. Okay, and they, if you continued to smoke past a certain date, now they put in all the support for the smoking cessation and the programs and so forth. But they'd actually done their sums and worked out that the cost of litigation for wrongful dismissal, which they knew it was not as much as the healthcare costs they were going to incur by having smokers work for them. So they went ahead and did it.
Okay, interesting one there.
Yeah, and a similar thing, Hershey, which is a town in the US that makes chocolate, of course, while we're talking chocolate.
Oh, that's where it comes from.
Yeah, so they had if you are over the threshold for any of the basic metrics like blood pressure, cholesterol, blood glucose, BMI, etc., you're actually docked 10-20% of your pay until you enter a program to manage that thing, and then you get all your pay back.
Do you think that's the right thing to do?
When those companies are paying for the healthcare costs of their employees, see, we have Medicare here, so you've got that. I think it's employers' right to do things that lower the cost of employment, like it's bankrupted.
You're the best argument I've heard for having a public healthcare system.
Yeah, I agree.
So people will do with this data what they want to do.
Exactly.
The data could back up whatever particular agenda you have.
And some of them are quite scary.
And some of them could be scary, but other people might agree with John that that's perfectly within the rights of the employer. Who's doing it for the health and benefit of their valued employees.
Yeah.
Tuck, I wanted to ask you something. I mean, what is it how are people experiencing this kind of level of monitoring? What are some of the key factors that make something either a delight or creepy? Is that too hard?
Maybe I'll rephrase your question slightly by answering it slightly differently, because a lot of people are taking this kind of self-tracking activities in all sorts of ways. And they're loving it. And commercially, you see that a lot of different units are being sold, and a lot more different kind of tracking systems are out there now for personal trackings. I think because people don't really realize what sort of data they're giving out and where the data are going. People are just clicking yes. It's a bit like that Facebook example about, we're just giving away information, thinking we're going to get all the benefits.
But there are lots of smart people who know their data is streaming to some server run by some guy in Silicon Valley, but they still want the app.
Yeah, I think
right? Are they just being ignorant and stupid?
Or they're conscious of the trade-off. But I'd say the vast majority of people probably aren't conscious of that trade-off.
It's almost impossible for us to understand it. Using your example, just a few days ago, there was a move in Congress against Uber, the new transport system. The management of Uber threatened to release the information of congressmen who on a Friday night didn't go to the address, which was their home, and were picked up from that address in the morning. There was such an uproar about that they had to withdraw that threat. So there was a tremendous risk that even sophisticated participants in the attention economy, in the information economy, can hardly calibrate that risk. And so we have to put a framework whereby people are educated about those kinds of risks and can manage them and make informed decisions in their own interests, or information that can be used will be used. And when you're going into a cafe and you see somebody there, your Google Glass will bring up their education and the fact that they're diabetic and that their genetic setup is not compatible with yours, and that their insurance rates will have to go up, and so on. So the power of this data, the power of this data of online data with CCTV data, positioning data, genetic data, the value of data from inside your body, if we don't manage to develop norms and regulation about what is the right way to use it, then it can be used in ways to manipulate us that we're not even aware of.
Okay, I think we're getting... I want to go back to Tok though, because you were on a journey somewhere.
Well, the journey just to follow you on is actually that I think we should be thinking about how we design such technologies. So I'm not saying that these technologies are evil, but what we could, I mean, it can be beneficial for people to raise awareness about, oh gosh, I'm eating a little bit too much, or I should be moving a little bit more, okay? But I mean, I'm not going to trust the precise number of steps that I'm taking, but you know, I'm going to get a rough idea about what I've done. But I think what needs to come in with this kind of applications and technologies is actually also transparency in the technology to let us know where the data is going. What sort of data is being taken and who's taking it?
Yeah.
I think
What are they going to use it for?
Together with what they're capturing and giving us benefits, we should also be made aware on those same interface, flip it on the other side and says, okay, so where are the data going today? And what do they know about me based on this? I think by balancing it out, I think, you know, then we're going to give people much better control. And then they can say, well, no, I'm not going to let this out. Okay, I think it's about giving it back to people, the control of the data itself, and I totally agree with you. So besides legislation, I think on a design level, that's why we're working on a human-centered design. It's about working with the users and talking to them, and a lot of them don't really realize, I mean, they're not stupid or idiot, but they just don't realize the extent of the pervasiveness of where the data are going and how it's being used and how it's being translated. And just one more is that, for instance, at the moment, after signing up with Fitbit online on my bogus email account, and because they know that, because I've got a loyalty card with Woolworths now put those two together and ask me to link my Fitbit data to my Woolworths account, and they'll give me 5,000 points. Loyalty points, you know, which will give me like, I don't know, $5 discount on my next shop. But then they can also sell me insurance. So they link my health, my eating, and insurance, and they can work out what I eat, how fit I am, and what premium should they be giving me because they know how old I am and that I'm a male and I'm this height and all that. The data is being traded, and it's being done right now.
But there's actually another sort of fairly toxic thing which we're not mentioning. I mean, anybody who knows anything about statistics knows that preventative health sort of, you know, in a sense, health education, health things like that is unevenly distributed. The lower you are down the sort of social scale, the less likely you are to pay attention to preventive health, healthy eating, exercise, chocolate biscuits, etc. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of data around about that. So what you're doing, and I mean, admittedly, lots of people you say are going in for the bangles and the Fitbits and the various other things, but there's going to be a level of society that doesn't have that sense of control over their lives. You go to the WHO, social determinants of health, and you know that this health is very unevenly distributed across the thing there. So the danger is that if you've got a particular thing like what you were talking about, where employers can get rid of people who are overweight, can get rid of people who don't do enough exercise, can get rid of people who have, you know, drunk the wrong thing or are having soft drinks or various other things, we are going to end up with an even more unequal society than we have now, and we're already going down the inequality trail. And so, I mean, in a sense, I think that stuff could be very toxic.
Right. So there's a strong rhetoric in the film about the levelling of the playing field.
Yeah, but this is,
but in fact, it could actually drive wedges and further disempower those who aren't data literate. And
people who don't feel it's sufficiently in control of their lives.
And aren't, yes, for all sorts of societal reasons, don't have the ability to take control of their lives.
So perhaps there should be legal limits to what consent you can give for how your data...
Because the notion of giving informed consent is almost a nonsense now.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's actually impossible to really know what someone might do
There
with
should
your
be
data.
bars on certain types of data collection and certain types of action on use of them.
Does the fact that big business isn't that interested in poor people matter? Does the fact that big business isn't as interested in poor people because their disposable income...
Yeah, that might have something to do with it.
Well, that just adds to the problem, doesn't it? Because they don't care whether they've got them either as workers or as customers, so they're perfectly prepared to dump them in the treat as pat, you know. of society. But if you're going to get a thing where employers feel they've got the right to sort of get rid of people who are overweight and who are, who have got diabetes and got various other things. I mean, I work in an Indigenous unit. You would cut out a hell of a lot of people out of the system who have come from socially deprived areas, and their chances of changing that would be nil, because they would feel even more outside the system. And if you look at things like Twiggy Forrest and his stupid bloody healthy care card, whatever it is that he's trying to put on people who are unemployed, you've got a perfect example there of something which, if you tied it back with the, with the big supermarkets and so on, you could penalise people for actually buying unhealthy food with their government funds, not just grog and cigarettes.
And it might be fat people today, but next year it could be people with blue eyes or with curly
or grey hair.
And that's why the Europeans are more, or grey, or old people, that's why the Europeans are more careful to protect privacy, not just as an interest to be traded, but as a right, because they have experience of the KGB, the NKVD, the Stasi, the SS. Those organisations, in their wildest nightmares of evil, tried to collect data. They could never get a fraction of the data that we're willingly giving up now to social media, and through social media as it appears through PRISM and Muscular to national security agencies, until now without our knowledge. So that is a threat. Now, our forefathers fought and defeated that threat to the invasion of our privacy and the kind of control that gathering of that kind of personal and sensitive information can result in. But now, in order to get free social media and ads targeted to us, we're willingly giving up this information to the largest corporations in the history of the world, and through them to foreign intelligence agencies.
Right. So yes, sobering reminder. Before we're going to throw it open to you guys in just a sec, but I just wanted to go to Glenn to ask you, what are the implications for a university of all this stuff? I mean, you're leading up research here. What does this kind of paradigm shift mean for a university? And you can choose to tackle whichever bits of that you want to, really.
Well, I think there are, broadly two sides. I'd like to think that there is good technical work to do in this space to build, a set of devices and technologies that can make our lives better. That's my optimistic part of my brain. I think there's a clear role for universities to help contribute to better policy, to laws, and to education. And I think there's a new course that we're proposing here at UTS, which was effectively designed to kind of improve numeracy right across the university, across all of the students. But the name of it, if I've got it right, is Arguments, Evidence and Intuition. And in my mind, that sort of education, building those sorts of skills amongst people, is critically important to help allow people to properly interpret data. I mean, we give numerous examples of people misinterpreting, just making stuff appear to be more accurate than it ever could have been in terms of how it was collected, and making wild misinterpretations of it, etc., etc. And I think maybe we should think about adding some modules into this along the lines of, the consent trade-off, where is the data going, and educating people on being able to ask those sorts of questions. So I think university has a really important role in this space.
I mean, one of the things you can try and convince them of is that there's no if A, therefore B, that what we're dealing with always is probabilities,
absolutely,
not certainties, and very few people understand that.
Right, and the irony, of course, is that we've gone from a world, if I think of my nana and papa, when I was a kid, I mean, it was almost like they were in a complete analogue world, and I'm 2 generations on from that, and my children have been born in a not completely, but effectively a completely digital world. But when we talked in the past, we got we used scales on maps, and we realised there was uncertainty now we get the device and it tells us it's 10.73 kilometres, and by God, it better be 10. And I've done 2,572 steps to get there. So I have a funny little anecdote on that. So I have a Fitbit in my pocket, and surely our DVC education and students kind of got me going on this. But then when I walk around with it at home, it's fantastic. It measures helps me think about getting enough steps in the day. But I've been doing a renovation on my house, and I bought a little truck, and I discovered that if I drive my truck, which is really crappy suspension, I can add about 10,000 steps just by driving the truck around everywhere, which is kind of, I can fool myself.
Okay. All right. Now, I hope that between the movie and what you've heard in the panel has provoked a few thoughts. So we've got a roving mic. Let's hear a few thoughts or questions from the floor. Sean, have you got a microphone somewhere? If you can just wait for the mic to arrive, then we'll just pick you up for the recording as well. That would be great. Sean, down here, right down in front of the camera. In front of the camera, this gentleman here. Thank you.
Peter.
You're on.
Peter Trebilco, University of New South Wales. I'm on the School of Public Health and Community Medicine, and have the great privilege of knowing Eva for many, many years, and she has never said anything stupid that I've ever heard.
Welcome, Peter.
Now, the most important message I got, and I agree with what every member of the panel has said about the different aspects of this rather messy movie that was made. I don't know what they were selling at all. I'm not terribly sure what the product was. But the most important message is one that was just passed over nonchalantly when one of the people said that ecology relies on our not overusing our resources. We've already done that. We are now using or trying to use more water than exists in the world. We are not feeding everybody in the world at least one meal a day. There are 24 million people in Africa who go to bed starving every night. And we're running out of potassium. And if you don't have any potassium, you can't transmit any nutrition between cell walls, be they plant or animal.
Right.
I think we have maybe 3 generations to go before we don't really have to worry about privacy any longer.
Okay. So an observation there. Does that provoke any thoughts?
I'd like to...
Where is the potassium going?
I'd like to respond quickly. I've been highlighting the dangers, as have been other panellists, but there are many beneficial uses of big data to address these problems by analysing them properly and by marshalling resources to address them. Our concern has been that unless you have proper regulation, the community won't have confidence in big data analytics. And unless there's confidence, they can't be deployed to help address these kinds of existential problems and other social problems that we have.
I think the other sorts of issue is who gets to do the analysis, who gets to do the research, who gets to do the things there. And I mean, that's a very real danger at the moment, particularly since the government seems to think that the best sort of research that happens is always in partnership with industry. That that there's less available money for things like called blue sky research and the various other things which are things like that. The universities are being turned into, excuse the term, tarts because they're supposed to make money rather than be sources of good information. And I think these are all part of the necessity for having a base to actually look at what's happening in the areas of data and to try and create an environment and there's things where some of the issues that Peter is raising and that you're raising can be dealt with by researchers who are appropriately funded to run things up that are not necessarily of commercial value.
Well, that is a prime role for a university, as Glenn was saying, I think. It's universities who have the perspective and the ability to make it clear to the policymakers.
Only if they've got the money to do so.
Yeah, but...
that's a bit difficult at the moment.
One can do good with business as well. I mean, business is getting quite a hard rap this afternoon.
Because they are accountable to their shareholders, not to the society at large.
Well, some businesses actually have a social conscience too. But, I think it does fall to universities to flag these kinds of big picture trends that many politicians and businesses are just too short-sighted to see because they're only caring about the next annual report or whatever. So yeah, another comment or question? Where's the microphone?
Over there.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah. Is this on?
Yep.
Yep. All right. So my name's Shabazz. I'm a data analyst at Sydney Trains. One of those things he mentioned about data not being accurate and we should have access to our own data. I think that's a great idea because us can be our own subject matter experts to see if the data is actually correct or not, or if one of those things that he talked about the number of steps that you can actually, like things that can produce errors in data can be actually, corrected by yourself. And for that, we need access for our own data. And maybe this data, if we can assign there can be professionals who can have access to that data and they can act as our motivators, or he can be our psychologist at the same time, our nutritionist, or he can be our career counselor, looking at our data and, keeping track of the trends and telling us what would be the next step for us in our life, or giving suggestions. So that's one of those things that I would...
Right, so there's a real emphasis there on returning back to the people who are in authority to say, is that actually an accurate picture or not, especially for citizens. Now, we're not used to being returned data, and as we've been saying, maybe you're not even numerate or literate enough to understand what that data is saying. But that's just part of the argument, I think. And I think we did hear in the film people saying, this has got a dark side as well. There was more emphasis on the bright side, right? But people were saying, we need to be in control of this. We don't want this done to us. We humans are the platform, so to speak, who can use this for all sorts of different ends. But we are talking about new kinds of literacy, really, new ways of reading and writing meaning, just as we went through other revolutions in literacy. Yes, there was a microphone up there somewhere. Hello.
Yes, I actually don't have a question. I was just going to say that prior to today, I never thought twice. I'm going to think twice before buying those tracking things, and think twice what I put onto Facebook. I had no idea it extended this far. And what has made me double think everything is the lack of humanitarianism in it. And how are we going to evolve if we keep on controlling all our actions? How are we going to change? And our human existence is about evolving. I just wanted to tell everyone thank you very much, and I'm going to reconsider it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yes, I'm afraid Facebook owns everything you've ever done there.
And I think you got to be careful as well, not just you not doing something on Facebook, it's what about your friends tagging you on their Facebook? Because then you get pulled into the pool as well. So, it's not as simple as say, I'm going to close my Facebook down. But what if you go to a party and someone takes a photograph and then they start tagging you? Or they take a photograph of you and they upload it onto Instagram and they mention your name. So there are many, many other ways in which we can end up being dragged into.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it's cultural, right? So now I have a teenage daughter. If she was to basically go off the grid, as some teenagers have chosen to do, and it's almost a political act of resistance now, isn't it, right? But you have suddenly removed yourself from the discourse of your peers. You have removed yourself from a way of projecting and constructing your new identity as a teenager. It's now become a systemic shift. It's okay.
Following her comments, I agree that actually we cannot isolate ourselves. When we walk around this university, we are being photographed. I believe so. Most of the universities now are so much controlled, can't get access to a building without having an ID or whatever way, or password, meaning that we are being traced. Now, the point I wanted to raise, I don't understand, I'm a health scientist, I was very interested to see how even children inside mother's womb being, detected and identified and et cetera, and et cetera. But can there be any super management of data? They can control the corporations or whoever using data for what purposes, if there is no control over it, I don't think big corporations are going to listen to us. They will manipulate data as they can for their own purposes. And that's where the ethics or moral things come. But I believe the universities possibly or researchers can find out a way to have a super control over the controls of data. Thank you.
Controllers.
Well, who controls those? Views on that? I mean, how do you regulate corporations, or any organization for that matter? And let's just remember, any organization has always used data to achieve its purposes. I mean, there's nothing new there. It's just they've got a whole quality and quantity more and tools that are new. Right?
Are there any UN conventions on data management or data ownership?
There's OECD guidelines, and in Europe, under their data directives, every corporation is required to have a privacy officer who's accountable for the lawful use of data. We don't have anything like that here. We do have a privacy commissioner. Under the Privacy Act in Australia, when we actually give to a corporation or to a government department or agency our details, then there are privacy principles which govern how those data are to be used. They're to be held securely, they're to be used only for the purpose for which they were given, and so on. But the Privacy Commissioner is a small office, and he has very little opportunity to monitor or regulate how those data are used. And that's why I float this counterintuitive idea that we might subscribe to commodifying our data, marketizing it ourselves, so that we can then manage it in a commercial way and license it. And we could say, well, nobody's allowed to use my data, or we license it for certain purposes, and we could set up our own agencies to manage our data, and we could charge for the use of it. Because I'm not opposed to corporations providing services. They're what make our society great and our economy function. But these corporations are making literally hundreds of billions of dollars by farming us for our data without us understanding it. And I would like us to be active, autonomous, independent citizens and consumers who manage our data in our own interests and who authorize corporations for certain uses, but not for others.
Now that sounds like the kind of challenge that the university sector should be perhaps seizing. You know, to create an infrastructure like that needs, you know, very smart computing, policy and legal expertise, understandings of human...
Good design skills.
Good design skills, just coming to that. And lots of testbed sectors, you know, health, finance, insurance, whatever it might be, to see, could this work? Could an infrastructure like that work, for example? You know, there's a grand challenge.
We have the technical infrastructure, we need the social infrastructure.
Yes, often that's the tricky bit, right? Okay, thank you for your comment though. Let's go over to this side over here. Just zoom over there, Sean, thank you. We want to pick these people up on the mic.
Ben Simons, UTS Data Arena. My question is about provenance. It's one thing, and I think this is perhaps the next step beyond big data, is understanding that the data can change. For example, everyone has a bank account. If my balance changes, I want to know why. How did were the transactions recorded? So, okay, there may be big data out there, but if the data changes, how do we know how it changed, who changed it, when did it change? This idea is generically called provenance. And I just thought perhaps we'd get a reaction from the panel or comments on provenance.
There's certainly a computer science kind of answer to that. You know, there are ways of tracking stuff. But I think as we've heard this afternoon, a lot of the answers to this come not just from is it technically possible, but does anybody want to make it happen?
Yeah. I think it fits in with the general question about accuracy. We don't even know if it's accurate when it goes in, so I don't know how you track whether it's accurate when it's in there. You know, there's a split there about sort of, you know, how, which is a technological thing about how often you update, how do you update, what do you update, how do you validate, and which really don't get addressed.
Yeah, I can only speak from personal informatics. I mean, even from my own personal use of these devices, I find that there's a lot of gaps and holes in it because I have to take them off for charging, or else I'll be continuously tethered to a computer. And you know, even though I can wear it in the shower and can swim with it, but I don't. So there are times in which I take it off, and you know, and there are times I forget to put it on because I've taken it off, and there are times in which they just don't suit the clothes I'm wearing. I'm going up for a certain, you know, I mean, people buy watches because it provides them with a sense of identity as well, you know. And so there's all these other really practical, pragmatic issues that we haven't thought about. Or sometimes you might lose your charger, or you might not in a place where you have capacity to charge, especially when you're traveling. So there's all that stuff.
So I don't know if it's fair to say no one's thinking about it, right? I mean, well, you know, John, talk about this. I mean, people clearly do care about the integrity of health data.
Yeah.
Right.
And for that very reason, the people take a Fitbit off to charge it. Often it never goes back. It doesn't go back on within 24 hours. You lose a day's data, and that's the start of the downhill slide. So, our people in the US work with the US military to develop this wireless system called Bodyland. It's 1/1000th of the power output of Bluetooth. So. The battery in that will last 1.5 to 2 years without a recharge and still transmit the data. So, as I said, you can miniaturise that, implant it, do it with the glucometer. We've even now got a simple Band-Aid that you stick on that syncs to your activity monitor because it's recording your heart rate. Once you have heart rate and a workload, an activity level, you can calculate cardiovascular fitness, what we call VO2 max. And so you move beyond tracking the activity. The activity is the process. The outcome you want is improved cardiovascular fitness. And so we now have a way that every day when you move, that workload and that heart rate will tell the system, will be able to calculate your improvements in your cardiovascular fitness, how much your stroke volume of your heart's increased to pump oxygenated blood around your body. And it's miniaturised and it's very low energy, much lower than Bluetooth.
You're selling them?
It's very worrying because what we call these devices are wearables, but we're seeing injectables. Yeah. People are hacking the body. Yeah. So there are examples of bodybuilders out there who have injected those sensors into the body so that they can actually get very, very precise and minute or second to second account of the nutrients and what they need to take next or what to inject next to get to their particular physique that they're looking at. This kind of body hacking, it's really scary.
They'll be implanting them in babies as they're born if we're not careful, and then we'll go on from there. There was a woman up there.
Right, but you're framing it in a very dystopic way. Good grief, we might be even injecting things into ourselves. Well, that needn't necessarily be bad, right? If that's going to save your child's life, you will inject it.
We're not talking about life-saving, we're talking about lifestyle in this case.
We might be.
This is the problem. You know, right? I think for everything we think of and discuss, I could mount a very evil exploitation of it, or I could describe a very noble
exactly
approach.
Yeah.
So the fundamental question I think we've got to come back to is how do we, educate people as to how stuff is used and what the potential misuse of it should be and how to do appropriate interpretation of it, and then B, how do we put an appropriate set of privacy regulations and so on that maintains an appropriate balance of freedom of use and freedom of good exploitation and tries to prevent. There'll always be evil exploitation of stuff and we'll never be able to exactly prevent it, but I agree, if it goes too far then we end up with, we could all think of some really horrific, outcomes.
Okay, going up to the back there.
Hi, I'm Sharon and I work in e-research here at UTS. One of the things that we deal with is the open research data, the idea of reusing research data for other purposes or for purposes which I think we can generally, in the context of today's discussion, probably consider to be relatively good as opposed to the kinds of commercial and evil reuse.
Don't say, not everything is commercial is evil.
No.
There are evil commercial organisations, but there are some nice ones too, okay?
I meant commercial and evil, or evil, sorry.
Commercial or...
Yeah, I realise that. So I guess what I wanted to ask about was we have fairly stringent conditions under which we're able to share research data concerning humans for reuse. So, I mean, in e-research, obviously we have to ensure that the data is actually going to, that the people have given, participants, have given prior informed consent for their data to be reused. And one of the most difficult things, I think, is to understand whether or not the purpose of reuse is similar to the purpose for which the data was collected. And a huge number of questions come up in this area. So I think that Michael Fraser's interesting idea about making data available, having ownership of our own data and then making it available under licence, perhaps doesn't need to be a commercial question, but it perhaps could be a question of we need to be able to licence who may use our data and for what uses they may use it. And another problem, of course, that arises here is that we can't always predict what uses data can be put to. So potentially it could be very useful, and I know Attila's favourite example was the use of ship's logs for climate change, for filling in the climate record. I mean, sometimes it's very hard to tell how data will be useful in future. How do we recontact people to say, is this an appropriate use of your data? These are things that we need both social and technical infrastructure to deal with. Yeah. And I personally think that the research sector and the university sector is a really good place to start looking at these issues. So
Can I reply? So I'm new to the university sector, and part of my portfolio of responsibilities is the ethics committees at the university here. So animal ethics, human ethics, and bioethics. And I've actually asked exactly that question. Given a big data world that we've entered, are we doing? What are the ethical implications of that from a research perspective? And how do we need to frame and manage data and reuse data and ask for its, reinterpret, et cetera, I don't know that I have an answer yet, but I think it's a really important question.
As an ex-member of the UTS Research Ethics Committee, and I was on it for quite a while, and as was Peter, I mean, I think what you're raising there raises a lot of issues about how much time and trouble we take for every petty little piece of research to try and work out that, whether people have given consent, whether it's ethical to do it, all of the sort of questions there, and this explosion of big data which appears to have no process about it. So maybe rather than just looking at the legal issues, there ought to be some sort of national ethics process that is set up, which it works rather like a university ethics committee, which takes a look at what the potential uses of the data are, who the potential users are, and what its value can be, and is able to proscribe the use of things where this threatens particular populations, creates particular damage or whatever it is. But something like that needs to be done like a sort of national, I mean, I know ethics is a dirty word at the national level, but we could try it for a change.
We've been talking about intelligent devices.
Yeah.
We can also make data intelligent itself, and these are the beneficial uses of big data, and we have the means to do so. So by attaching metadata to the information, we can establish what the provenance is, how that data may be used, the authority for using that data, by tagging all the information with the metadata, which gives the permissions.
But we would need a national set of things to determine the framework.
You need a normative framework and a regulatory framework so that corporations can exploit it for legitimate and beneficial means. Universities can on different terms and conditions, and individuals can, so that these norms that we need to think about and we're thinking about here can be operationalised. So the means to do so are there to exploit big data for beneficial ends. We just have to take up the responsibility to do it.
So let's use computing power, metadata, and all the tools available to us to actually try and regulate the use of computing tools and big data.
What we need are the criteria and the processes to feed into that.
I agree with all of that, and my here's where I become very, very pessimistic is, watching, was it the Attorney General struggle on television to try and even get the words metadata out
Well, let's
give a
not set
cohesive...
the bar there.
No, but ultimately we do need to convince the politicians about the need for this, and so we've got to have good policy and be able to have those discussions and have them in a way that frames the problem appropriately.
Can we suggest that Universities
Okay.
Australia, apart from trying to sort of turn themselves into corporate something or others, could pick this up as an issue? That this might be a really useful issue for the university sector to pick up and sort of push up at the sort of national level.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to move on to a couple of other topics if we can.
Did she have another question?
Well, I'm just trying to cover the ground here. So there's going to be the opportunity to chat afterwards as well over some refreshments. So let's just cover, we had somebody down here? Yep.
There's also somebody right at the back there.
Okay. Sean, down here.
Oh, sorry.
There we go. Let's just, yeah, okay.
Just curious, in talking about the control of all of this and you're sort of licensing your own data, I mean, isn't the genie somewhat out of the bottle? Every time you click the I agree box, if you certainly can't negotiate that. You can't use any of the apps or access any of the information without saying yes to that. But once you've done that, if you kind of just sit down and read through what it is they say they can do and what the amount of data they can collect, it's pretty enormous. I mean, how do you recapture that and sort of drag that back in and change that paradigm?
That was the sort of point I made earlier. We can think of all the evil things, and I think people are doing some of them. So I think we have to come up with, a pragmatic approach to kind of changing, educating people and developing appropriate policies. So maybe we need a sort of centre for responsible use of big data. Don't know where we get the funding for such a thing, but the genie is well and truly out of the bottle. You only have to look at that film to understand that. Maybe we need some, big data disaster to occur to kind of wake people up to the potential misuse of this and actually get some...
I think his name's Ed Snowden, isn't it?
Well, those contracts about giving consent to those privacy policies are such unfair contracts that arguably they might be unenforceable. They're so long. The asymmetry in knowledge, understanding and power between, say, Facebook, I have nothing against them in particular, but they're a prominent example, and an individual who's in a weak moment wanting some kind of service and clicks through. Has anybody in the room ever read?
Yeah, I asked exactly the same question.
No,
Who's ever read the terms and
too.
conditions?
I never read them, I just tick them off.
There's a gentleman that has, but they change all the time.
Right.
And so perhaps we ought not to be allowed to consent to a policy that in effect says they can do whatever they want with that data. By the time you get to page 30, that's what it amounts to, and come up with these kinds of norms around the table about what is permissible, maybe some templates about, approved...
Maybe the equivalent of Creative Commons,
but
which made available legal speak, but in a publicly accessible form.
It needs something like that in order to have truly informed, true consent.
But the challenge here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the underlying business model that is being used that, I think Google kind of pioneered, where it's a trade-off of information that I provide aggregated across an enormous population, provides an enormous amount of information to be exploited. That is the essential business model that underpins all of the kind of, Instagram, Facebooks, Googles, the whole, all of the iTunes, everything sort of effectively works on that basis. And if I think back, I can't think of that business model ever existing in a pre-digital world.
What are we going to do? We can't wind the clock back on that.
But there's a difference between using the mass data in general ways which can be looked at in one way and then being able to relate it back to the individual, which becomes
the point I was going to make is
more
though,
problematic.
this business model is what underpins this.
Yes.
And everybody has accepted it in an implied way because we're all gaining some value from it. I get free searches, I get this, that, I get some free cloud storage or whatever. So it's almost like people have willingly or unwillingly, probably, but, you know,
uninformedly.
you know, in order to get people aware of it, we have to get people to accept that what value I get from it has a consequence, and I don't think we're really having that conversation yet.
Yeah.
So people are going to continue on down that path of using all of those services, and my kids are using those services as you know,
and
7,
they're great
9,
services.
11-year-old, and they're great services. So we almost have to face that kind of that's the elephant in the room, I guess. Face that elephant in the room in order to kind of make some
But
changes
people
here.
do not know it can be tracked back to them individually and used against them, and that's where the point of the argument starts becoming which hasn't been had, you know? Was that thing there?
Okay, we've got time to take one more question or point. Yep, at the back there.
I'm Barbara Davis. I run a small business. Could debt collecting agencies be made to send quarterly statements to each person that they're keeping tabs on?
Okay, and the connection to big data being they're not using the data that they've got in a socially responsible manner.
True.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
Anyone disagree with that? Motion approved. Yeah, I mean, there's a nice example. They're sitting on data. They could be more or less helpful with it, but in their own interests, they're perhaps being less helpful from the point of view of and so forth. We're done for movies. We're done for our panel. Let me thank the panel, and let's give them a round of applause as well.